Hello and good morning, afternoon or evening, depending on when you are listening to this, the latest video in our Sussy Talk series, a series of videos designed to keep you connected to sustainability leaders during lockdown and beyond. We hope you've been enjoying the series so far, and I'm really excited that for today's episode we are joined by the Executive Director for Business for Nature, Eva Zabey. How are you doing today?
Very well, thanks. Excited after a busy day yesterday with our big event.
Yeah, so I've covered this on the edie site, but for those who weren't aware, Business for Nature had this really big webinar yesterday with thousands of people dialing in from all over the world to sign and learn about a new commitment for building back better and embedding considerations of nature in that, and that has already been taken up by a number of big companies. So Danone, Unilever, Natura, the big cosmetics company that owns like Avon and The Body Shop, have all committed to it, as well as a number of businesses from across the world. So I guess it was great to come along to that. But I wanted to ask, so you guys think this was the first Build Back Better online event that was specifically about nature? And I wanted to gauge sort of why you think that topic might have gotten less attention than a lot of calls to action around net zero, so low carbon energy and technology, for example.
Well, thanks so much, and thanks for the opportunity to share with everyone online. Maybe just quickly that yesterday, thousands of people around the world joined this event that really demonstrated this business leadership around nature, but not only the leadership, also the momentum. And that's what Business for Nature is really about. So we're a coalition of 50 business, but also conservation organizations like the World Economic Forum, International Chamber of Commerce, WWF, and many others. And our overall aim is to unify this leading business voice, to give policymakers the courage and comfort to make ambitious agreements on nature. And that's why yesterday was so important as a moment to demonstrate that momentum. And the reason we think nature hasn't been seen in such a visible way, I would say, as the climate negotiations or climate building back better for a green recovery is probably just because it's a bit more difficult to get your hands around. Nature is foundational to absolutely everything. So nature is everyone's business. Over half of the world's GDP, so we're talking $44 trillion of economic value, is at moderate or severe risk due to nature loss. So healthy societies rely on nature, resilient economies rely on nature, but also thriving businesses. And we really need to understand that all of these systems are interconnected. So when we build back better, we need to build and rebuild and strengthen that resilience of those interconnected systems. So I don't think, maybe just one final point is that I don't think it's an either or, climate or nature, that actually climate and nature go hand in hand. And it's wonderful that overall there is momentum around all of these building back better green strategies. It's just that we felt the nature agenda hasn't been getting as much attention, probably because it's more invisible.
I think that because of this invisibility, which I think some people might say, oh, it's harder to measure or it's harder to understand, like you can get metrics on emissions or on waste really easy, but on things like biodiversity or just nature in general, it's a lot harder. And as a result, when we get an announcement from a business that says, oh, we plan to preserve X amount of habitat or create X amount of habitat or plant X amount of trees, we always get green groups saying that's great, but how did you come to that figure? So I wanted to get your advice on how businesses can develop plans that are actually ambitious enough in line with what's needed. So we have obviously science-based targets for emissions so that businesses can align with the scale of the climate emergency, and I know that similar ones for nature are forthcoming, but sort of in the interim, how do businesses make sure they're actually stepping up enough?
It's a really good question, and it raises one of in fact, the first of our 5 policy recommendations that came out in January, which is basically calling on governments for this more clarity on the ambition and the direction, providing that those global goals that now we have, the 1.5 degrees for climate. So what is it for nature overall? Because having those global goals actually helps companies manage that uncertainty, because when they have the certainty from the political side, it means they can invest in these solutions, in these processes in a much faster way. So now what we've got is we've got voluntary action, which is great. And we know that, for example, 400 companies have made commitments in different ways to reverse nature loss. 1,200 companies are taking action. The message here is that it's just not enough. We need to urgently scale and speed that up. And that's why we're going to the policy ambition, because we can only do this together with governments, businesses, everyone, to protect, restore and sustainably use our natural resources.
Mm-hmm. Great. And then, as well as policy, one of the big topics that was discussed in the webinar was a lot of collaboration. It comes up again and again, and it's always welcomed. Business always seem to have like a real passion and inspiration for doing this, but do you think they're up to the challenge of sort of moving past competition and pivoting in a post-pandemic world? And any advice for doing that, really? I think people are looking to form partnerships that just aren't for partnership's sake, don't just look nice on paper.
Yeah, absolutely. So there are the two things. There's the companies collaborating together, which is something that we've seen much more of. And then there's the companies partnering with others. So companies partnering together in COVID has been quite exceptional to see how competitors have worked together to come up with the solutions that are needed. On the nature side, I would say quite a lot is going to be pre-competitive. So the resources, and not only the natural resources, I'm thinking vanilla, but also the ecosystem services that everyone relies on will be a benefit, but also a potential risk if not properly managed to all companies. So it makes sense to work in that pre-competitive space. And then on the companies working with other organizations, this is where the realization that there is such a skill gap in companies currently, that we're bringing expertise from decades of work about understanding how these ecosystems work, how they provide services, that these services need to be valued. How do you then, is what you were talking about before about the methodologies, how can there be some consistent way of measuring? And in the absence of that generally accepted approach, what existing tools, because there are hundreds of them that already exist that you can experiment with, focusing on making better decisions within your company and then being able to demonstrate that externally. I think what's quite interesting, again, going back to COVID, but is that since the beginning of the crisis, sustainable or ESG investments have had better than average results. And that's been a bit of an acid test for sustainable investment, because people were looking at them saying, hang on a second, are they going to live up to the challenge? And now the trend is, well, they'll probably pick up even more, so there'll be an increased growth of sustainable investment. But it goes back to, well, how do you measure that?
Yeah, there's definitely a lot of debate around at the moment about how do we define sustainable, and even with funds raising, it looks like people are more interested in the social part of ESG. So there's considerations around
I think that one of the messages that came out of yesterday was, in any case, people have to be at the center. At the end of the day, that's what we're talking about right now, is not a nature for nature's sake. It's actually our whole species survival right now. And actually, if you think about it, financial performance is irrelevant on a dead planet. So what we're talking about is people's livelihoods and well-being, but you still can't have healthy people on an unhealthy planet.
No, of course not. And I feel like in lockdown, a lot of discussions about nature have come out. There's a lot of columns in newspapers of people saying, oh, this has made me realise how important nature is. I've really reconnected with nature. Instead of a commute, I'm now going for a walk. I'm now going for an isolated litter pick. So if people are the centre of this, I just wanted to get your view on what you think the sort of individual public mood is on this, and whether you think that will last after we emerge into the new normal.
It's gonna be a bit tricky and painful, to be honest. I can already see. I live in Geneva, and we've got out of lockdown, I think, earlier than others. you can see that there is already complaining around the traffic jams because bigger cycle lanes have been put in place. But the cyclists aren't all up and running yet because there's been a transition, and it goes back to that, any crisis will accelerate a transition that's already underway. What we need now is that transformation, and that's going to be painful both at an individual level for some people as they get used to adapt to this new normal, but also for companies that whole business models will be overthrown and they need to adapt to this new a new interconnected approach to these systems.
Mm-hmm. So how is your team working at the moment? Are you back in the office, or are you more of a global team, or are you still working from home?
Well, I'm at home right now, and we actually are all working from home today. Our team is quite remote, so I have colleagues in the States and in the UK anyway. So actually, for the first time yesterday for our big event, we did half of the team met up in person to be together for the big event, even though the event was online. But yeah, it's been tricky. The first few weeks in particular were really tricky with the kids, and we got complaints from our neighbors downstairs because we were making too much noise. And I tried to explain that it was because I don't have an office at home, and so at 6:30 in the morning had to set up shop. So there we go. But you do what we can, and then I think it just gives a sense of we need to make this moment meaningful.
No, for sure, and hopefully online events will be a way for doing that. I know my colleagues are working really hard to try and get our first online conferences up and running in the coming months. So if they go anything as smoothly as yesterday, I'm sure we will be very happy. But I think that's all we have time for on the call. So thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you so much.